Imagine you pay $30 a month for a Netflix-like service, but instead of movies, you're subscribing to access to hundreds of video games. That's Xbox Game Pass and similar services in a nutshell. But what happens when that $30 becomes $40 or even $50? What's the tipping point where subscribers quit? And what does that mean for game studios relying on these services? Today, we're going to dig into the recent Game Pass price hike and examine whether the subscription model is sustainable for gaming, and ask who really loses when streaming games become the norm. So here's how we'll break all of this down. We'll first start by talking about the context and recent events, what Microsoft just announced and how big the hike actually is, and we'll also talk about what else is changing down the road for Microsoft. And then we'll get into the economics behind subscription models in gaming and how renting games differs from ownership and where the losses or pressure lie economically. Then we'll get into the impact on developers and publishers, the pros, the cons, and the risks associated with streaming services like Game Pass. Then we'll get onto the consumer side of things, what users gain, what they lose, and where this becomes untenable. And then we'll look at, the conclusion and the outlook and, what needs to change, what alternatives might emerge, and your call to action as viewers. So obviously, if you guys haven't been paying attention to the news, Microsoft is raising Game Pass Ultimate from $19.99 to $29.99 a month, which is, a 50% increase. It's insane. And they are also apparently reworking other tiers. This kind of jump isn't small, and for many users, it forces a huge reevaluation. In gaming, it's not like movies or music. Development costs are huge. Games wear out over time, and there's a tension between lots of games versus depth and, high quality. And if this model collapses, studios and big publishers could suffer, and consumer trust will erode. Okay, so obviously Xbox Game Pass has been one of Microsoft's flagship products for this entire console generation. It's been marketed as the Netflix of gaming. You pay one flat fee, get access to hundreds of games, including big day one releases, and for years, it seemed like the best deal in gaming, but now that deal is starting to show some serious cracks. As of this month, of course, Microsoft officially raised the price of Game Pass Ultimate from $20 to $30 per month. The base tier Game Pass Core, which replaced Xbox Live Gold, also saw some serious adjustments, and there's now a new mid-tier called Game Pass Standard, which is priced at $15, but this doesn't contain the day one release feature. So, the day one feature, that's the thing that made Game Pass special. It's now exclusive to the higher priced Ultimate tier, and that's a clear sign of cost containment. Microsoft is trying to stop bleeding money by limiting what cheaper subscribers get access to. And a lot of people have been predicting this because Game Pass has always been a loss leader. According to multiple reports and insider leaks, Microsoft has spent billions acquiring games and covering licenses to fill out the entire catalog. Phil Spencer himself has acknowledged that Game Pass isn't profitable yet, and that's after more than 5 years of operation. Think about that. $1 trillion company can't turn a profit on a service that was meant to revolutionize how we access games. That tells us something fundamental. The math just doesn't add up. You see, subscription models work when costs per unit are low, the product has infinite reusability, and customer churn is manageable. That's Netflix, Spotify, or Disney Plus. But games are different. Every game is a massive one-time expense. You can't reuse a AAA title the way you can stream a movie 1,000 times at no extra cost. So Microsoft keeps pouring money into licensing deals to keep Game Pass fresh, while at the same time many subscribers only pay for 1 month to binge a game and then they cancel it. That's completely unsustainable from a business and cash flow standpoint. So here's what's happening now. Microsoft raises prices to slow the losses, players cancel to save money, Microsoft loses subscribers, developers see fewer incentives to put their games on the platform, and Microsoft then needs bigger exclusives to pull people back in, which costs even more. It's a very self-defeating loop. The exact same loop that we're seeing across all entertainment streaming services like Netflix, Spotify, Disney Plus, Paramount, all raising prices to compensate for diminishing returns. So the question becomes, why is this so hard to fix? Why can't Game Pass simply balance its books like Netflix did? The answer lies in how game development and licensing differ fundamentally from film or music, and that's where things start to get really complicated. When you look at Xbox Game Pass, so the question becomes, why is this so hard to fix? Why can't Game Pass simply balance its books like Netflix did? The answer lies in how game development and licensing differ fundamentally from film or music, and that's where things start to get really complicated. When you look at Xbox Game Pass from a player's perspective, it feels like a steal, $15 or $30 a month for hundreds of games, but from a developer perspective, it's not nearly as shiny. In fact, it can be very risky. When a game lands on Game Pass, the developer doesn't get paid every time someone downloads it or plays it, at least not in most cases. Instead, they get one of two things: a flat licensing fee, which Microsoft pays up front for a period or exclusivity, or Game Pass access or something like that, or a revenue sharing deal where the developer earns a percentage based on engagement or player retention. On paper that sounds fine, but in practice those deals often don't make for lost sales. Why? Because players who would have bought the games at a full price are now accessing it as part of a cheap subscription, essentially. So let's say a studio spends 3 years developing a $30 million project. Normally they'd expect to make that money back through sales over time. But on Game Pass, they might get a $3 to $5 million licensing fee up front, and that's it. It's great cash flow early on, but it caps the game's lifetime revenue potential. Once it's out there for free, full price sales nosedive. Independent developers have publicly admitted that Game Pass gives them exposure, more eyes, and more downloads, but very little profit. Exposure doesn't pay the bills, and visibility alone can't fund their next game. Microsoft has been footing the bill for these deals for years, building a gigantic library. But if subscription growth slows or prices rise, that money dries up. When that happens, smaller studios won't want to participate, and the Netflix of gaming loses its core appeal, and that's variety. We're already seeing this shift. Fewer mid-tier and indie titles are launching day one on Game Pass compared to 2021 and 22. Big budget releases like Starfield and Avowed are carrying the weight, and those games are developed in-house under Microsoft, not by outside partners, and that's a big warning sign. This also pressures Sony and other publishers to respond. Sony's PS Plus and Ubisoft Plus are trying to emulate the model, but they're also struggling to make it profitable. And remember, Sony already has more blockbuster exclusives, yet even they hesitate to put day one games on their subscription tiers. Why? Because the economics don't work long term. Developers want predictable revenue, not a lottery. The subscription model turns that predictability into volatility. So if developers are getting squeezed and Microsoft is losing money, then who exactly benefits from this setup? For a while, the answer was the consumer, but that too is starting to change, and that's what we'll look at next. So Game Pass was supposed to be a no-brainer for a consumer. One payment, hundreds of games, no $70 purchases, no risk, no hassle. But over time, what started as a dream deal is slowly turning into another example of subscription fatigue. When Game Pass first launched, it offered incredible value. For $10 or $15 a month, you could access major first-party titles like Halo Infinite, Forza Horizon 5, Starfield, and dozens of indies. You could try things you'd never buy otherwise. And if you didn't like a game, no problem. You weren't out any extra cash at all. This created a sense of abundance. But abundance only works as long as prices stay low and quality stays consistent. And lately, neither of those things have held true. The most recent Game Pass price hike might seem like just a few dollars, but that's not how consumers think. In the last 2 years alone, nearly every major subscription has gone up in cost. Netflix, Spotify, PlayStation Plus, Apple TV Plus, and now Game Pass. The average household now pays for 6 or more subscriptions. That's unsustainable for most people, especially in a market where wages haven't kept up with inflation. This psychological effect is clear. When every company is raising prices at the same time, consumers start cutting somewhere. And for many gamers, Game Pass is starting to look like the easiest one to cancel. Here's the key metric: engagement. Microsoft wants people to play more, but the reality is most players don't. Studies show the average Game Pass subscriber only plays a handful of games regularly, usually the same franchises they'd buy anyways. So that hundreds of games marketing pitch, it sounds amazing, but often doesn't translate to real value. And as Game Pass splits its tiers, removing day one access from lower plans, the perceived value goes down even more. People will ask, why pay $15 a month for old games when I can just buy the ones I actually want? Another major problem is ownership. When you buy a game, it's yours. You can revisit it in 5 years, mod it, replay it, and keep it forever. With Game Pass, your access can vanish overnight when licenses expire. And this destroys players' trust. I mean, imagine being halfway through a 60-hour RPG and finding out it's being pulled from the service next week. That uncertainty makes the model feel fragile and temporary. And, temporary entertainment doesn't build loyalty. The industry has seen this before. The same thing that's happening in streaming TV. Too many options, too many price hikes, too little satisfaction. Eventually, players get tired, they start trimming down, keeping only one or two subscriptions. For some, that'll be Netflix or Spotify, not Game Pass. For others, it might be going back to buying games outright during sales or through Steam. So we've established that the economics don't work for developers, and fatigue is settling in for consumers. In our final section, let's pull it all together. What does this mean for the future of the gaming industry? Is there a better alternative, or are we watching the streaming bubble burst in real time? So where does this all lead? We're watching the gaming industry repeat the same story we've already seen in television, music, and film. The streaming bubble is bursting, and like every bubble, it's ending for the same reason it began. The math simply doesn't work long term. Microsoft, Sony, Ubisoft, EA, and even Netflix with its gaming division, all of them bought into the same idea that you can scale endlessly by offering people unlimited access for a flat fee. But infinite growth doesn't exist when your costs keep rising. Games aren't like TV episodes. They take years to make, cost hundreds of millions, and once a player finishes, there's no guarantee they'll touch it again. The illusion worked while interest rates were low and companies could spend freely to chase subscribers. But in today's economy, profitability actually matters again, and Game Pass's entire foundation depends on endless spending. We're already seeing the cracks in the streaming industry. Netflix has clamped down on password sharing, Disney Plus is merging tiers and cutting costs, and Game Pass is raising prices while reducing value. The next step here is consolidation. Smaller subscription models will vanish, only the biggest players will survive, and even they'll have to reinvent themselves. For Xbox, that might mean fewer third-party deals and more focus on their own ecosystem, first-party exclusives, PC integration, and cross-platform cloud gaming. But even that doesn't fix the consumer trust problem. Look, at the end of the day, games aren't disposable content. They're stories, art, and memories. Things we replay years later because they mean something to us. Treating them like a streaming checklist cheapens that connection. And the subscription model isn't evil, but it has to evolve. If it keeps chasing growth instead of sustainability, it'll burn out both the people who make games and the ones who play them. So the next time you see a price hike on Game Pass, don't just get mad at Microsoft. Ask why this keeps happening. The answer isn't simple, but it's important. The system isn't broken because of one company necessarily, it's broken because the economics never fit this model to begin with. And as players, we get to decide what future we want, short-term convenience or long-term value and ownership. If you found this breakdown useful, make sure to drop a like and comment your thoughts down below. I would love to hear them. And subscribe for more deep dives into the business and economics behind gaming. Thanks for watching, and as always, play smart.